A Cathedral of Salt. Chapter 1. The letter that tasted of the sea. The letter arrived, soaked through with fog, salt whitening the edges like frost. The postman didn't bother with my buzzer. He left it on the cracked tiles of the third-floor landing, where gulls sometimes landed to scream and remind me that I had left the coast, but the coast had never left me. When I bent to pick it up, a few grains of salt clung to my fingers, sweet as glass on the tongue, and for a childish, superstitious second, I thought the envelope might hiss if I held it to my ear. The handwriting on the front, angled, beautiful, decisive, spelled my name as if it were a verdict. Elara Wren. No return address, no stamp smudges, except the faint ink of a coastal town that might have been a bruise. Graymouth. I had not said that name out loud in 6 years. I carried the letter inside and set it on the wobbly kitchen table I'd rescued from someone's sidewalk rejection. Tea kettle, chipped mug, slant of afternoon. The city had its rhythms the way the ocean did, only here the tide was traffic. I lived in a sorry apartment that smelled like dust and orange peels, and I worked an even sorrier job selling antiques I never owned to people who wore linen in winter. It wasn't a bad life. It was simply the one I had chosen instead of Graymouth. Still, the envelope was a blade slipped between ribs. I pressed my thumb into the corner to rip it, and then stopped, confronting the tenderness of old habit. How my mother would open every letter with the silver fruit knife. How she would say, "Paper deserves a better death than tearing," and smile as if she had not been born in a town where letters arrived mainly to announce storms. The kettle whistled. I turned it off and let the room return to its ticking and the distant lift of sirens. The envelope seemed a creature of its own breathing, and I finally tore it, greedy with sudden fear. Inside, a single paper, thick and high fiber, bearing the crest of the Mercier Trust, a pair of herons braced against a wave. The text was formal and clipped, and I had to read it 3 times before the words arranged themselves into anything like sense. "Miss Wren," it began, "we regret to inform you of the death of your aunt, Dr. Corinne Wren, on the evening of September 7th at her estate in Graymouth. You have been named the sole heir to her property and effects, subject to the conditions delineated in the Wren-Mercier Covenant as recorded 1873. You are requested to present yourself for the execution of the will on September 20th at 11 a.m. Mercier House, 11 Cathedral Row. Executor, Silas Adrian Mercier. I did not sit. My body forgot chairs existed. The name silenced the room so thoroughly that I could hear the thread of steam still escaping the kettle, the city's breath behind my wall, the dull syllables of my own heart. Silas. Our world was a small one, and though I had never met him, I knew that name the way one knows the names of saints and storms. The Merciers and the Wrens had been entangled for longer than our town had called itself Graymouth. We brought the salt. They brought the stone. My family harvested and preserved. Theirs built and sealed. The old rumors, sung like lullabies, said that a Wren had saved a Mercier from drowning under the cathedral cliff, and that, in gratitude, the Merciers had granted us a right, no, a refuge within the cathedral they were carving under the earth. There were darker versions, too, a debt, a bargain, a vow paid in years. Those were stories you told by candlelight in winter to make the wind listen. I grew up in a house where the sea slept with us, and my mother kept the blinds up to let storms watch. When I left Graymouth, I told myself I would not be the kind of woman who ran back to a place that chewed bones as a hobby. Yet here was a letter that used the word soul and the word covenant, and more than that, it said the name Elara Wren, my aunt, my mother's sister, the woman who taught me the structure of tides and the patience of fossils, the one who laughed with her whole face and scolded me for reading in the bath. Dead, I didn't cry. Salted women don't, my mother used to say, when she wanted to be cruel to both of us. Instead, I stood very straight and drank my tea cold and let the letter tilt the floor under my feet until the city and its cranes and buses slid a few inches to the left. Then I folded the paper and put it back into its envelope and tucked it into my bag as if it might flee. That night in bed, I went to the sea without moving. In the half-sleep that has more truth than waking, I walked the length of the old pier where barnacles grow like teeth, and boys jump in winter to prove their courage. I heard my own footsteps, and another set a little behind. I did not turn, because this is how one keeps ghosts at bay. The wind smelled of rain and stone. In the dream, the cathedral under the cliff pulsed with its borrowed heart. The rooms carved in salt, the lit chandeliers that never dripped, the chapel, where names were etched into the wall with the patience of grief. I had not thought of it in years. It rose into the dream like a lifted hand, and when I reached the end of the pier, the other footfalls stopped directly behind me. I put my palm on the rough post and felt the sea breathe. "Come home," someone said, and it was not a voice I knew. It was not a voice I did not know either. It felt like mine and not mine, like all inheritances. I woke before the gulls. The road to Graymouth is a ribbon frayed at one end. You drive north until the map loses interest, then you keep driving, because memory is a compass that points toward pain. September in that part of the world means a sky with opinions and hedgerows that inhale, horse fields, a church in permanent shrug, power lines like notation. My rented car moved through it all with the stateliness of regret. I told no one where I was going. I left my boss a voicemail that used the phrase bereavement exactly once, and I watered the haggard fern that insists on living in my window, and I put my one good dress into a suitcase as if I were packing the absence of a person. Somewhere outside of the city, I passed a roadside market selling jars of peach halves floating in sugar water that refused to admit it was syrup, and for an instant I thought I saw my mother's hands counting change. The past is a magician. It can saw you in half without touching you. Graymouth announced itself with a swirl of gulls and the hard line of the cliff. The cathedral was there, right where the land broke open. Not the spire that visitors photographed, but the door to the under, a dark mouth under a lip of stone. Long before it was a tourist curiosity with tasteful plaques, the Merciers had sunk their ambition in the cliff and excavated rooms out of salt ballrooms and passageways, galleries and halls, built to cool the salt harvested from the flats, to bless it, to store it, to guard it in walls that would not burn. During winter storms, when other towns drowned out their own windows in plywood, Graymouth floated its chandeliers underground and danced. If you went down on clear days, you could hear the whole cathedral sigh. I drove straight to Aunt Corinne's house and did not go in. The Wren house sits on Perseverance Street, facing the harbor with the kind of silent contempt old houses are good at. It is narrow and tall and peeling pale blue, and if you lean out the second-story window, you can see all the way to the white tents that mean the salt fair is in town. The rosemary bush beside the porch is older than anyone alive, and the brass knocker on the front door is shaped like a fish with an expression of permanent surprise. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the place where time had chosen to stop counting, and my body did a strange thing. It turned itself slightly toward the right, toward the direction of Cathedral Row, as if I were a compass after all. The will wasn't until tomorrow. The letter gave me 24 hours to relearn my own gravity. I found a room at the inn above the bakery, where Mrs. Hart used to bring me stale buns in exchange for the news that I had nothing and everything to tell, and I lay on the too-soft bed while the smell of sugar argued with the smell of rain. I meant to sleep. I meant to pretend that Graymouth was not a place where my face had once been part of the landscape. But when the shadows finally rose, they did not lift me gently into evening. They dropped me into it like a stone into a pocket of the sea that had been saving a place with my name. The cathedral is open late for those who remember how to move in the dark. I did not take a lantern. I know the path. There are 17 steps carved into the cliffside. The 15th is twice as tall as the others because the carver was in love and thought of something else while his hand moved. If you run your fingers along the right-hand wall, you will find the seam where the last flood breached the seal. It feels like a healed wound, and perhaps it is, in the way all stone is scar. The air dropped 10 degrees as I reached the door. Somebody had oiled the hinges because the cathedral did not complain when I went in. The main hall is the first thing you see. The long vaulted room, the glitter of stalactites cut and coaxed into chandeliers, the salt glowing the way bone glows in X-rays, ghostly, intimate. Footsteps echoed. Mine, and, for a second, those imagined companion steps again, close enough to be a superstition. I stood there with my hands at my sides and did not cry. It would have felt like rainfall at a funeral. Miss Wren. The voice came from my left, from the smaller passageway leading toward the old Briners Chapel. It was a man's voice, low, smoked at the edges, and I knew the name that would come with it before he stepped into the light. He was taller than I'd thought, and younger and not young, 32 or 36, one of those ages that turns on its heel when you try to approach. Pared down like a house in winter. Pale, dark-haired, in a suit that did not apologize for cost, but did not boast either. He wore no tie. His throat was a blade. The light found a stubborn scar at the corner of his mouth, just enough to interrupt his beauty and turn it into something you had to work to look at. He was wet with salt air, as if the cathedral had breathed on him. "Mr. Mercier," I said, because it was easier than saying his first name, and because sometimes anger disguises itself as courtesy. He smiled, and the scar deepened, a companion to the movement, not an enemy. "Silas," he said, "you should call me Silas. We are going to have to be familiar with one another, given the circumstances. People always do that with grief, clear their throats around the exact shape of the thing. Given that my aunt is dead," I said, because the word needed daylight. "Yes," he nodded. His eyes were gray, but a salt gray, not a city one. "I was sorry to hear of it," he said, and then, after a beat that was either respect or audacity, "I'm more sorry to be the first person you see here." "You're not," I lied, because the cathedral had already welcomed me like a hand on my back. We stood for a moment in the gallery of carved anchors. The air smelled like a memory kept in a glass jar, cool and faintly sweet. The last time I had been here, I had tracked mud across the floor and been scolded by an old man who wore a mustache like a dare. Now the floor shone with its own restrained light. The anchors on the walls, you could trace the generations by their styles, clean lines for the newer families, baroque curves for the old. The Wren mark was small and stubborn, tucked at the bottom like a nail driven into a plank no one would ever see. The Mercier mark was everywhere and nowhere, the room itself, the ceiling's mathematics, the certainty of wanting. Silas Mercier did something dangerous then. He said my name like he had paid for it. "Elara," he said, "I am truly sorry. I admired Dr. Wren. She was a sharp mind. Sharp minds make this town livable. You admired her?" I couldn't help the curl of skepticism. From what I understand, the Mercier Trust admired her only up to the point where it could not own her. A flicker at his mouth. Not offense, exactly more like amusement at a predicted weather pattern. "You have your mother's way of aiming," he said. That staggered me. "You knew my mother?" "I know everyone who makes Graymouth," he said, which was not the same as an answer. "But yes, I knew her. Dr. Corrin, too. She spoke of you. I doubt it was kind." "It was precise," he said. "That's kinder than most." I wanted to argue and found I was tired of my own armor. "You sent the letter," I said instead. He glanced toward the main hall as if to share the blame with the space itself. "My office did," he said, "but I asked that it be done properly. You deserved that." "We will disagree on what I deserve," I said, but softer now. "What are the conditions of the covenant? Your letter managed to be both explicit and cagey." He folded his hands loosely in front of him as if to prove they were empty. "You inherit Dr. Wren's estate house, research notes, a few small holdings upon the usual verifications, but the Wren-Mercier covenant, as recorded in 1873 and renewed twice since, requires that the heir remain resident in Graymouth for 1 full year following the execution of the will to ensure the continuation of the Wren stewardship of the Saline Registry. During that year, the heir acts as liaison to the trust for the maintenance of the cathedral galleries and the salt flats. I blinked. The Saline Registry is a ledger. 8. I am beat. "The ledger," he said. And though the word felt like a relic, he made it sound like a pulse, a catalog of harvest, of brine times and yields, of the old recipes for keeping a town alive with salt and not merely seasoning it. Your aunt did the work last. Before her, your grandfather. It is Wren work. Mercier builds the vault. Wren keeps the book. That is the covenant. I laughed, and it startled both of us. The sound cracked. "So my inheritance is a house with a leaking roof and a job as an unpaid clerk for your family." "Not unpaid," he said mildly. "And not my family. Graymouth. If you prefer, think of it as a tax, a ritual, that remembers the reason we did any of this in the first place." "You make it sound holy," I said. "Perhaps it is," he replied, with too much care to be careless. We looked at each other for a count that made the word wary flirt with the word curious. Somewhere far in the cathedral, water ticked. It was easy in that moment to dislike him for what he stood for, the trust, the old money, the way his suit wore him instead of the other way around. It was easier still to dislike him for his face, but there was a steadiness to him that annoyed me by flirting itself with relief. The "I've got this" of a man used to walking into rooms whose ceilings were falling and convincing them to stay put. I broke the look with an act of petty childishness. I turned away first. "The will is tomorrow," I said to the anchors. "At 11, he said. "And you wanted what? To welcome me to town with a tour of your crypt?" He laughed, and this time it did not slice me. It surprised me, soft around the edges. "I wanted to see if you would come here first," he said. "If you did, It meant we could have a different kind of conversation. What kind? The honest kind, he said. And that lapidary word honest caught the light oddly in his mouth, as if it had more facets than usual. This place makes liars of us when we speak anywhere else. Because it remembers, I said, and he gave me a look that was close to pleased. Because it remembers, he agreed. Graymouth forgets every 5 minutes, unless it is convenient not to. The cathedral forgets nothing. You're a Wren. You were taught to tell the difference. I was taught to leave before the forgetting swallowed me, I said. And how did that taste? He asked. But he asked it gently. It tasted like not drowning, I said, which is not the same as swimming. Then you might welcome a year of learning to do something else with the water, he said. My laughter again, this time because I despised the way his words made a path through me. How very Mercier of you to recommend turning into the wind, I said. He bowed his head, conceding the point. I'm only telling you that your aunt left you more than a ledger. She left you the job of deciding what the ledger is for. Why me? I asked, not meaning what the sentence means. I meant, why a woman who refuses to carry her own middle name because she cannot bear to taste her mother's salt on the tongue? Why a woman who took a city like a pill because you came back? He said simply. There was a bench along the wall, carved with fish chasing their own tails. I sat because the suddenly serious thing that was rising in me demanded a stable surface. Silas did not sit. He leaned against a column with the casual eloquence of a man who has never been told he cannot lean against things that belong to him. Will you move into the house? He asked. I haven't decided, I said, which would have been untrue even if I had not already put the key in my pocket. The inn has fresh bread. The house has rosemary and a roof that pretends to leak more than it does, he said. And your aunt's desk. Does your knowledge of my inheritance extend to the contents of the desk? I asked, bristling. My knowledge extends to the fact of its existence, he said. The ghost of humor there. Dr. Wren worked in the small back room on the second floor, with the window that faces the alley. She liked to hear the sound of deliveries. She said that noise made time move properly. And there it was, a detail too precise to be a line. My aunt's voice in his mouth, like a song played on a different instrument. Rage flared up in me, not at him, but at the intimacy of grief, its audacity, the way it puts hands on our furniture without asking. I stood, jaw tight. You loved her? I said, accusing the air between us with the wrong past tense and the wrong verb. He did something with his face that I could not read, and then let it pass. I respected her, he said. I feared her a little. I envied the way she made silence into a blade, but the word love should not be thrown like salt. You speak like a priest, I said, and you like a storm, he answered, and for one stupid, dangerous moment, the space between us had the tensile shimmer of a fishing line about to cut skin. We did not step closer. The temple of salt kept us honest. Tomorrow, 11, he said again, almost as if to himself, I will send for you. I know the way, I said. He nodded, but he still said, I'll send for you. And then he was gone, walking into the smaller corridor and up a set of steps that were not for the public into whatever back-of-house men like him inhabit, keys, lists, a city worth of signatures. I stood alone and dropped my face into my hands and finally cried, only a little, only enough to feel the salt of my own body join the larger salt that built this room. The tears did not fix anything, but they reoriented the map a degree or two, the way sailors used to use certain stars to understand where they were wrong about the ocean. When I left, the cathedral exhaled. The house did not pretend to be happy to see me. I think it had preferred Corinne's footsteps, which were quick and decisive and always seemed to go exactly where they meant to. I moved through rooms like a trespasser in a zoo. The hallway smelled of old lace and lemon oil. The kitchen had a cracked tile near the stove that caught crumbs like tiny ships. In the pantry, a jar of coriander had given up and collapsed into its glass coffin. Everything had the deliberate hush that follows arguments. Ghost-like houses such as this, not because of death, but because of all the things not said when a door closes. Upstairs, the small back room waited with its window on the alley. The desk was the same as the one in my memory, a slab of wood carved with little notches where my aunt used to rest her pencil while she thought. The drawers stuck and then grated open with that grim little satisfaction that only well-used furniture provides. Inside, a tangle of rubber bands that had perished, a blue ribbon that may or may not have belonged to my mother once, a stone that was not pretty in any conventional way and therefore must have been precious, 2 pens that had bled themselves dry, 3 paper clips performing a delicate embrace, and at the bottom a stack of notebooks tied with twine. The first notebook contained recipes for preservation, written in a hand that became more passionate and less legible the angrier the recipe made her. Salt ratios, timing, notes about weather events. Don't trust the 4th day after a storm. The sea lies about its mood. The second was a ledger, private and not, coded initials, dates, quantities. If you stared long enough, the code was almost friendly, like a language you might learn if you were patient and lonely enough. The third notebook was for letters never sent. She had written to my mother at least 100 times. I sat there with my thumb on a page where Corinne had attempted the sentence, "I know why you left," and then failed to complete it half a dozen times, the lines starting and smearing in different directions. I did not cry again. I simply watched the way ink dies even when it is trying to live. On the desk, there was something else, something not paper, not wood, a ring box, cheap. Inside, a key on a black cord. The key was not like any house key. It was heavier, older, with teeth too elaborate to be practical, and a stem etched with a pattern I recognized from childhood drawings. It was the pattern they used to carve into the candles during the salt fair, the symbol for survive. I turned it over in my hand and then set it back in its box without putting it around my neck. I told myself it was because the cord looked flimsy. The truth was that it felt like a collar, a noise downstairs, the sort of careful knock that is 90% permission and only 10% sound. I went to the staircase and called, "Yes?" A voice rose female, reed strong, familiar in a way that made my ribs shift. "Elara." I descended into the kind of embrace that has to be assembled. Ivy Hart had been my first almost friend and my last almost love. Our childhoods had been moored side by side, and then, because we were who we were in a town like Graymouth, unmoored with the violence of a cut rope. She was shorter than I remembered, or I had made her tall with longing, which is the curse of 12-year-olds. She had the same red-gold hair in a knot at the back of her head, and the same face that looked like it refused to break without a contract. She smelled of coffee and a newspaper printing press because she now ran the Graymouth Gazette with the weary grace of someone who knows how to balance truth on a spoon. "Oh," she said, and her hands were on my shoulders, and then we both seemed to realize at the same time that a decade is too long to make a bridge without checking the weather. "I'm sorry about Corinne." "Me too," I said. and the words fell like coins into a well, bright, then gone. I brought bread, she said, because some rituals do not age. And wine, if you're the kind of bereaved person who wants wine. I am the kind who wants bread, I said. And that was true. We ate in the kitchen without speaking for a while, the way you eat with someone who once knew how you folded napkins. Ivy watched me like I watched the tide prepared for education. Finally, she said, "Heard you went to the cathedral. Graymouth is still an efficient gossip machine, I see," I said. "Only when the subject is interesting," she said, smiling. "You saw him." "I saw him." "Careful," she said. "Silas is an undertow." "You think I don't know what an undertow is?" "I think you think you're a better swimmer than you are," she said. And I loved her for saying it, and hated her for being allowed to. "What do you know about the covenant?" I asked. She shrugged. "Enough to respect it, enough to suspect it. The Merciers carved law into salt before the county even had a courthouse. We all behave like that isn't stubborn as a cathedral full of ghosts. Are you staying?" "I don't know," I lied. She put her hand over mine. The gravity of old kindness. "You do," she said, a softness that did not demand anything more. "You always did know what you were going to do, even when you hated what it was." "You could have left too," I said, surprised by the unkindness in me. "I did," she said. "I went away, and I found out that no other town wanted me half as much as this one did. So I came back and married a man who loves me exactly to the edge of his fear, and I run a paper that will not outlive me, and on Thursdays I buy oranges, even though they taste like the idea of sun and not the thing. That's not a tragedy, Elle. It's just a sentence with a period at the end." "I always liked exclamation points," I said, because I could not say the bigger thing, which was, I have never learned the difference between leaving and running. She finished her bread and wiped her fingers slowly, carefully, as if the crumbs were something that might retaliate. "He'll be at the house sooner than is polite," she said, not quite a warning. "Silas?" She didn't say yes. She didn't need to, because that's how he controls the narrative. He arrives, and then everyone rearranges themselves around the fact of him like iron filings around a magnet. "I don't rearrange," I said, defiant as a child. She smiled again. "We all do," she said, "but some of us pretend better than others. 11 tomorrow?" 11, I said. When she left, the house exhaled again, as if relieved that the town had approved my presence. I went back up to the desk, then back down to the kitchen, and could not make any room fit. So I went outside. Graymouth at night used to be a series of unlit portraits. Now there were more lights, more glass, more places to buy the idea of a life you were not living. The harbor was the same. Boats asleep like folded hands, masts ticking out the calendars of the wind. I walked down Perseverance Street and onto the quay. A boy and a girl smoked near the water. A dog considered the idea of jumping in, then decided domesticity suited it. Across the gap of black, the cliff rose, and the cathedral under it held its breath again. Someone fell into step beside me with the kind of measured audacity that makes you feel as if a choice has already been made. "You left the window open," Silas said. I did not startle. I did not give him that pleasure. "Are you patrolling Perseverance Street now?" "Graymouth is my job," he said, as if he were admitting to a vice. "I thought your job was owning Graymouth," I said. "Tempting," he said, "but no. Ownership is a more obvious and less interesting hobby. Caretaking is harder. It demands taste and ruthlessness in equal parts. And you have both," I said. He glanced at me, not in vanity, but as if to check whether the accusation was a location or a weather report. "I do," he said. We stood at the rail. The sea made the sound of metal, remembering it had once been ore. I could feel him near me without touching me. It was like standing next to a well-designed fire, precise heat. I hate to admit that it steadied me. "Your aunt wanted you here," he said after a minute, and when I did not answer, he added, "She said the town was running out of people who can tell the difference between remembering and regretting." His head far. "That seems like something she would say when the whiskey was low," I said. "She said it clear-eyed," he replied. Dr. Wren knew how to break a person open with remarks like that. Sometimes I think Graymouth is a test she designed. "And who passes?" I asked. "Those who are willing to be wrong in public," he said. "You're very good at making everything sound like a choice," I murmured. "It is a choice," he said. "It will be tomorrow. You can sign and stay, sign and leave, not sign and leave, not sign and stay, though I suppose that would be a show." "And what would you prefer?" I asked, pivoting toward him because I could not help it. "What I prefer is irrelevant," he said. But he said it in that way people do when they're trying to convince themselves of their own decency. I waited, and he obliged the truth. "I prefer that you stay." "Because you need a clerk," I said. "Because Graymouth is better when the people who owe it their names are trying," he said. And then, softer, "Because your aunt deserved a decent successor, and your mother," he cut the sentence off, the way one closes a window against a sudden storm. "My mother what?" I demanded, the anger sleep-warm in my mouth. He looked at me as if I were a map he both respected and resented. "Your mother taught me that you can be loyal to a place and lethal to the people in it at the same time," he said quietly. "And I think you suspect that too. I'd like to see what happens when someone refuses to be either." I was suddenly too tired to parse the insult from the challenge. "You talk like a man who wants to be forgiven for something he hasn't done yet," I said. Silas's mouth moved in what might have been a flinch. Then he leaned a fraction closer, enough to put the scent of salt and clean wool into my nose. "I talk," he said, "like a man who knows that every gift in this town comes with a chain woven into the ribbon, and I am choosing to show you the chain. It is honesty," I said grimly. "Your favorite word." "No," he said, "my least favorite, but it works." There was a music on the quay, then a buska with a borrowed guitar making an old song new by means of willing it. The notes traveled ragged and brave, as all salvage does. Something in me dropped a weapon I had been holding without noticing. I turned to face him fully. He did not move his hands. He did not move at all. He let me look at him like most men never allow, without the need to protect himself from being seen. It is a risky thing, intimacy that isn't touching. It's the kind of risk that ruins you for safer options. "You knew my mother," I said again. And when he didn't answer, I said, because I was cruel in precisely the way Ivy had warned me, "Did you love her?" "No," he said, and the swear he placed under that single syllable broke it cleanly into two pieces. "I never loved your mother." "But you loved someone," I said. He smiled, and this time the scar and the mouth were at peace. "Of course," he said, as if that were the only possible answer, and as if the person in question had not required either celebration or apology. The sea beat its hands softly against the pier. I should have gone then. I should have walked back to the house and closed the window and put the key around my neck and sworn an oath to myself that I did not believe in this town's beautiful knives. Instead, I said, "Walk me home." He did not put his hand on my back. He did not perform the chivalries I thought I mistrusted. He simply matched my pace, which is its own kind of intimacy, and in silence we moved up Perseverance Street. At the gate, he paused. The rosemary made the air time sweet, and the porch accepted me without comment. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice lower. If a voice can behave like a candle in a room with a window open, his did. "There will be versions of me you have not yet met. Don't mistake any of them for me." "I'm not especially gullible," I said. He inclined his head. "No," he said, "but you are hungry, and hunger is a kind of faith." "I have no faith," I said. He smiled. "You have more than you want," he said. "Good night, Elara." He did not reach for me. I went inside with my body intact. In the dark of the small back room, I put the key on the cord around my neck because superstition is simply love with a headlamp. It was cold against my skin, and then not cold. I lay down on the narrow bed with my aunt's notebooks arranged like talismans around me and closed my eyes. I dreamed the cathedral again, but this time I was not at the pier. I was in the chapel, where the names are etched, and I carried a candle that did not drip. The air hummed with the quiet of stored storms. On the wall, under Mercier and opposite Wren, there was a word I did not recognize. Or perhaps it was my own name spelled in a way I had not yet earned. I reached up and touched it, and the salt took the print of my finger. Then the whole wall breathed, and the breath was not a ghost's. It was the sea learning to forgive the shore for existing. I woke to the sound of rain, real rain, blunt and thorough. I kept my eyes closed and listened to it test the roof and then approve it. Somewhere in the house, a pipe knocked like a secret I did not yet know how to translate. The key rested against my chest, a small answer waiting for its question. The day would ask. It always does. Tomorrow at 11, in a room with ceilings designed to make people think about their posture, I would sign a book that believed in me more than I had any right to expect. I would meet the other versions of Silas Mercier he had promised, the executor, the host, the storm door. I would see Ivy in a corner, watching with eyes that remembered the same childhood I did and had chosen to arrange it differently on a shelf. I would keep my back straight and my mouth calibrated and say as few words as possible, because words grow teeth in rooms like that and I am soft-throated. But tonight, the town held me without bargaining, and I allowed it. Salt roared in the distance. Salt slept under the cliff. Salt sat in the jar on the kitchen shelf that had gone cloudy with time. I lay there in the dark with the key, the notebooks, the smell of rosemary, the knowledge that grief grows a root system in us so quickly we mistake it for our own bones. And because I could not stop myself, I let the smallest possible prayer escape, not to any God I recognized, but to the kind of covenant that exists when two people look at the same dangerous thing and consent to be altered by it rather than try to own it. The prayer did not have words. It had a cadence, like footsteps matching mine close enough to be superstition, steady enough to be a promise. And somewhere in the cathedral the chandeliers shivered, and somewhere in the town a man who loved salt more than money closed his eyes and saw the same wall of names, and the sea, which is not romantic but is patient, rehearsed the shape of the next wave. Chapter 2. The Covenant That Cuts Both Ways. I woke to rain arguing with the gutters like two old men who have known each other too long to bother with courtesy. The key lay against my skin, no longer cold an animal that had learned me. I lay still and let the house calibrate itself around my breathing, the way a body accepts a new weight after a time. Somewhere a cart went by in the alley, metal rattling, the sound my aunt claimed made time keep us straight back. I had not understood the compliment until now. On the desk, her notebooks had dozed themselves open in the night, pages lifting and falling with the draft. The ledger's ink had the particular gloss of something written with attention. Attention is a kind of holiness, she used to say, impatient not with distraction but with carelessness. The last entry dated September 7th. My mouth went dry around the number. Brining complete for lot 431 local, flats east yield 18.1, storm suite to be set aside. Note: do not trust the fourth day after a storm. Under the numbers, the line of her hand lifted once more, the way her sentences always gathered themselves before a leap. Then a single word: remember. It did not say what, because salt assumes its own context. By the time I put the kettle on, the town had decided on a mood for the day. Graymouth performs its weather. It does not merely endure it. I wore the one good dress, the one that made me look older and less forgiven, and tied my hair back the way my mother did when she wanted the world to take her personally. At 10:45, the promised knock announced itself like a deadline. "Miss Wren," said the man on the porch, hat brim dripping. He was somewhere between 30 and ageless, as drivers are. Crisp, courteous, the kind of presence that makes an expensive car look less like a sin. "Mr. Mercier sent me." "I know the way," I said, "because rituals must serve both parties, or they serve no one." He inclined his head. "It is raining, ma'am," he said with the seriousness of a priest. "Then we will arrive baptized," I answered, taking my coat. I locked the door because grief makes burglars of relatives. We drove the 3 minutes in a silence that behaved like conversation. When the car turned onto Cathedral Row, I could feel the trust money working itself into columns. Mercier House had the kind of face old money buys for itself when it decides to live forever. Stone pale enough to dare the sun, windows like eyes that prefer not to blink. The ironwork on the second-floor balcony was a forest of restraint. At the door, a woman with hair the color of obedient smoke greeted me by name and took my coat with the kind of respect people reserve for either saints or problems. The room for the will had ceilings that made you reconsider every choice you'd ever made about posture, a carpet that could forgive anything, salt white walls trimmed in a gray so careful it refused to have a name. Ivy was there, arms folded, a bundle of ink and question marks. A half-dozen others, Graymouth in miniature, dressed for solemnity. Mr. Law, who sold rope and regret down by the harbor. Mrs. Pike from the school board, a young woman with a face I knew without ever having seen, one of the new families who had come for the story of the town and stayed for the taste. And Silas, he was the version he had promised, executor exact. The suit today had a tie, and the tie made his throat less a blade and more a decision. He did not smile. He did not move toward me, which is a kind of courtesy more intimate than approach. Our eyes met with the professionalism of accomplices in a crime neither of us had quite committed yet. "Miss Wren," he said to the room, making my name into an item on an elegant list. "Thank you for coming." And it had his hand. It seemed polite, I said, because honesty in such rooms needs the mask of dryness to keep its teeth from flashing. The legal woman Rosamond Keats, Mercier counsel, with a mouth like a bead, read the thing that needed reading. Aunt Corinne's voice had been hammered into clauses, bequests as clean as recipes, a watch for Mr. Law, a watercolor of the old pier for Mrs. Pike, a file of letters to be delivered unopened to my mother if she could be found, and to me if she could not. The house to Elara Wren, together with its contents, debts, obligations, and the rosemary bush, if anyone thought to make an inventory so absurd. The saline registry to remain in my custody, together with the responsibilities attendant, weekly Briner's audit, equinox counting, liaison work with the trust, and there, folded between the ordinary words the way a dangerous fish hides its bones, came the condition. Subject, Rosamond Keats read, to the heirs' agreement to the Wren Mercier covenant recorded 1873 and renewed in 1911 and 1978, requiring a year's residence and the assumption of the registry. The covenant further binds the current Wren steward and the current Mercier steward to act in joint care for all substructures beneath Cathedral Row, including but not limited to the Vault of Names, the Flats Gallery, and the Apocrypha. The covenant requires the yearly vow at equinox, in the presence of witnesses, and the recognition of the chain. I put my hand on the back of the chair in front of me because it was either that or put my shoulder to the room and shove. "The what?" Mrs. Pike asked, scrupulously polite. Respectable women always speak for the disquiet of the room. It keeps the rest of us from asking for torches. "The chain," Rosamond said, and the capital letter clanged, the phrase used in the covenant to describe the consent by which the Wren steward and the Mercier steward bind themselves to the custody of the cathedral's vaults. "It is not literal," she added, with the kind of carefulness that tells you it is both literal and not. "It is a phrase. She glanced at Silas, for once not owning the words she wore, "a formality." "Formality," Ivy repeated, tasting the syllables. "We are a town of formalities," Mr. Law coughed. "Your aunt kept the book like a priest," he said to me, his voice careful with grief. "If you do it half as well, we'll all live." "No pressure," said Ivy, too softly to travel far, and yet the room heard. "If Miss Wren declines?" the young woman with the new face asked. Her bracelets didn't dare sound. "What happens then?" "And he have a blaz. The house and effects remain hers," Rosamond said without glancing down at the paper. She had done this too long to pretend she needed anything but memory. "The registry reverts to the trust for custodial purposes until such time as another Wren withstanding. She shot me the kind of look paper uses to enforce lineage is willing and able to assume it. In the interim, the trust will appoint a temporary clerk. There is also," and here her voice changed by a single molecule, "the small matter of the Apocrypha. Without a Wren steward, its custody becomes delicate." "Define delicate," I said, because the room needed one person to insist on nouns. Silas lifted his head very slightly, a gesture I later learned meant, "Allow me." "The Apocrypha," he said, and the syllables fit him like an old coat, "is the part of the registry that keeps the things we have not yet found the right names for, the losses that are not loss, the gains that cost too much to call profit. It has been locked for some time. It requires a Wren key to open. That is one of the conditions we renew when we renew the vow." My hand went to the cord I had tied the night before. The key lay there, heavy, an old tongue learning modern grammar. "Equinox is in 2 days," Ivy said from her corner, folding herself tighter. "You left yourself barely a year, El." "Dr. Wren liked a clock," Silas said. "She trusted a deadline to find the edges of a person." "And you," Ivy said, "trust the dead to help you manage the living." Silas accepted the accuracy like a coin. "The dead are consistent," he said quietly. "The living are weather." Rosamond resumed. "There were signatures, the graceful murder of pens. The witnesses watched the ink dry with the hush of people hoping that watching will make it behave. More clauses. Then a table of numbers for the stipend that would make the word unpaid a lie. The paper waited. The room held its breath like a cathedral where chandeliers do not dare chime. I signed. I wish I could say I did so out of bravery or love. I did it out of accuracy. The rightness sat in my bones like a weight I had set down without noticing. Every other choice would have been a strange performance of someone else's idea of my life. The signature looked both like and unlike my mother's. If a person can inherit the angle at which ink meets paper, I had done so. After people said the words people say, the ones that allow them to be kind without having to interrogate their own kindness later in bed. Rosamond gave me a copy. Mr. Law shook my hand with the silent plea men carry when they hope you will not rearrange the ways they have learned to cope with drowning. The young woman with the bracelets smiled like a person learning a language and trying not to apologize for her accent. "Congratulations," she said, as if I had won a prize. "It must be," she searched for the word grief without asking it to sit at the table, "a lot." "It is a unit of measure, yes," I said. "A lot." "You're going to be fine," she said. "The way people speak to themselves when they maybe are not." I murmured something appropriately unspecific, and then flare of relief. Ivy was there, her shoulder against mine as if we had learned the same drills and remembered them. "You okay?" she asked, in a code so simple it would forgive any answer. "No," I said, "but also yes, and also neither." "Good," she said briskly. "Ambivalence suggests a functioning conscience." Silas, having allowed himself to be the executor for long enough to reassure the room, dismissed the version politely. He became host lighter, more fluent. Coffee arrived with the burnt sweetness of competence. A plate of pale cookies that were better than pale cookies have a right to be. He moved among the people with the choreography of a man who knows that charm, like salt, must be both sparingly and generously applied. When he reached us, he did not attempt to assimilate Ivy. She had her own weather. He let it blow and only addressed me. "Will you come?" he said question, not command, and see the Apocrypha. "It is appropriate, given the date." Ivy looked at me like the harbor looks at a storm, unsurprised, resigned, a little thrilled. "Of course you will," she answered for me, "because we are the kind of women who prefer the truth in ugly rooms." "I'm the kind of woman who prefers ugly truth in ugly rooms," I corrected. "It keeps the aesthetic cohesive." "Bring a coat," Silas said mildly. "The catacombs are colder than the cathedral." And, he hesitated, the margin of the sentence more honest than the text, "the chain requires witnesses." "You choreograph well," Ivy said. "If you ever tire of institutions, consider the theater." "It is the same job," he said, "only with better costuming." We walked. He took us out a back passage I had not noticed and down a stair that insisted we pay attention. By the time we reached the door to the underpassage, the hum of the house had become the breath of stone. We went the other way from the 17 steps, through the part of the cathedral that does not pretend to be made for tours. The walls here did not glow with their own memory. They absorbed light the way grief does, respectfully, entirely, with a promise to give it back when ready. When we reached the room he called the Apocrypha, I stopped just inside the threshold because the air had a taste. "What is that?" I asked, not because I feared it, but because I refused to fail at naming. "Time," he said, "and bitumen, and a little mold, but mostly time." The Apocrypha was not large. A library would have embarrassed it, but the small room held itself with that particular density rooms achieve when they contain something that is not for casual hands. The shelves along the walls cradled boxes thick, narrow, bound with straps of waxed leather, a single table in the center. No chandelier here. The light came from cut shafts that did not seem to have an origin, the way a good lie does not. At the far wall, a brass-framed panel waited with all the leisure of a locked thing. He gestured toward it. "The chain," he said. The panel bore the crest, herons and wave. Between them, 2 narrow slots. Above the slots, the faintest outline of letters, as if someone had thought better of making names permanent and rubbed. I could read nothing but possibility. He set his hand to the right-hand slot, palm open. "The covenant requires consent," he said, and the words did something to my spine I did not enjoy. Not merely presence, not merely lineage. Consent, given aloud, and witnessed. "By whom?" Ivy asked, stepping to the side, as if to keep both of us within her field of estimation. "The living," Silas said, "always the living. The dead are too consistent to witness consents worth anything. Rosamond is fetching Mrs. Hart. We try to choose 2 who understand salt and pepper in equal measure." There was a silence that was not silence. Not the absence of sound, but the fullness of it. "You can decline," he said to me, soft enough to persuade even a hard woman. "The house remains yours. The ledger goes to caretakers who will keep it neat and lifeless. The town will go on telling itself whichever version of itself it currently prefers. Your aunt will forgive you." She understood the human cost. "And the other choice?" I asked, needing it said in both languages. "You accept the chain," he said. "You accept me." It was the first time he had used the pronoun like that, unhidden. "You accept the room's weight. You accept the thing we've always done that no one will admit is a practice of love. And then you learn what it is you inherited beyond the key." "What kind of love requires a room like this?" Ivy asked, not sarcastic. "The kind that keeps a town when the water tries to take it back," he said simply. Rosamond returned with Mrs. Hart, flower on her apron, a detail that made me love the universe's commitment to arranging its own jokes. The 2 women took their places near the table, solemn in the way of people accustomed to solemnity as a muscle, not a performance. "Ready when you are," Mrs. Hart said briskly, as if we were about to take a picture we would forget to frame. Silas placed his palm over the right-hand slot. "Silas Adrian Mercier," he said in a voice that kept itself straight, "consents to the chain." "Consent is a door," Mrs. Hart murmured. "The only one worth oiling." I put my hand to the left slot. The metal was cooler than honesty. My reflection on the brass had a face too serious for my age. The key around my neck lay very still. "Elara," I started, and the rest of me chose the name my aunt liked best. "Corinne Wren consents to the chain." Ivy reached out and touched my elbow, not to restrain, to make the room remember the body that belonged to the voice. The panel warmed under my hand and then accepted the idea of our palms. We pressed down together. The brass took our weight and laughed at it. There was an internal sound, like raw sugar breaking. The panel's seam softened. Then it slid back just enough to reveal a cavity no larger than a book. The key pulled against my sternum like a dog answering an old name. I took it off its cord and set it into the cavity and felt something yield far beneath the floor, the way a ship yields when a rope decides to become a line again. The panel opened. Inside, the Apocrypha did not live on paper. "Salt," Ivy whispered, darting forward without daring to touch. Oh, good God! The interior was carved like a relief, lines bitten into a slab of salt thick as a door. Not text, no letters I could read, lines and curves, a topography of something not land, a map of a thing that moves. The longer I looked, the more my eyes refused to agree on scale. It was intimate and immense, a palm and an ocean. Only when Silas lifted his hand and hovered it over the patterns did my breath find a root. "Tides," he said. "Not the ones the tourists look up and ignore. The patterns that govern what happens when storms speak to the shape of the floor under us. Every pattern we have learned since the first carvers. Every risk, every rescue, every bargain. My great," he paused, naming the ancestor with the accuracy of men possessing family trees rather than forests. "Emile Mercier convinced your ancestor to commit it to salt rather than paper. Because salt remembers differently," I said, not as a question. "Salt remembers as a body does," he said. "It stores damage and the instructions for repair in one place." Mrs. Hart exhaled in that absent way people do when the room is too full to add their sound. Rosamund Keats, who made a living from paper and its signatures, stood with her hands clasped specifically to keep them from doing anything as human as reaching. Ivy reached anyway, and her fingers hovered over a line that looked like an artery. She did not touch. The room did not forgive touching. "What does it do?" she asked. "It tells us what to do," Silas said, with the kind of softness men use only when the thing they speak of can kill you. When to open the underground sluices, which streets to sacrifice so the rest can breathe, which cellars to flood, which boats to let go. "Sacrifice," I repeated, and the word cuffed me the way true words do when you're not braced. "This town survives because we choose which parts of it drown," he said. I thought I had known what the chain meant. I had thought it was a ritual that made me part of the furniture of Graymouth. I had not understood that consent here required the courage to draw water over a map where people lived. "Your aunt," he said, as if he owed her the pronunciation of her title, "chose better than any of us. She counted the lives the way a person counts out bread. She never pretended it was not a horror. She insisted that it be done with utter clarity, with witnesses, with the salt itself ready to argue back if we lied." "Does anyone know?" Ivy asked, talking to the air so the truth could find more ears than ours. "Do the people who live on the streets you drown know that we have been choosing them all along?" Silas closed his eyes for one beat. "Some," he said, "the ones who remember, the ones our grandparents told by accident and who chose not to put it back in our mouths, the ones who wake up knowing the weather is a god and behave accordingly. And some do not know and would not forgive us if they did." I looked at the map in salt. I thought of my mother's insistence on storms as spectators. I thought of Aunt Corinne at this wall, candleless and exact, counting unthinkable arithmetic into being. I thought of how the ledger was a book about food, and how hunger is a form of faith, whether or not you call it that. "Why me?" I said again, without the defensive curl this time. "You could have let it revert, appointed a clerk with no lineage to break if the town turns on you." "Because you won't choose neatly to preserve your job," he said. "You will choose messily to preserve your soul. And because you came back, and because," he faltered, for the first time since I had met him, and the falter was the most persuasive part, because I do not want to carry this alone any longer. There, the dark romance of it, ugly and honest as a wound that refuses stitches. He wanted me not as adornment, not as conquest, not as the correct wren-shaped answer to a centuries-old problem. He wanted me as a person with a spine who would press her hand to the same metal and then argue and console and rage and choose. What did she choose last? I asked, touching not the salt but the air over it, as if to feel the heat of a ghost. The quay, he said. 2 years ago, a storm we underestimated. She cut the underground gate under Dunsany Lane, burned 3 shops up to the keels. We saved the hospital. She wrote it in the ledger like an apology you hope you don't need to send. The room had eaten all the oxygen. Ivy made a small, involuntary sound, then swallowed it for later. Rosamond's hands had exhausted their pose and just looked like hands. Mrs. Hart nodded, the way bakers do when a loaf splits precisely where they predicted. How did she? My throat closed, then reopened. How did she die? Silas did not offer me a easier truth than the one he had. She went below during a storm, he said, alone. She had stopped going down alone for years. She did that one last time. His ma de ox and aid olam be. Fell? Ivy asked, the word a kindness. Chose, Mrs. Hart said, looking at the map the way women look at a body they recognize too well. Some work takes the last thing it requires, which is the worker. The room gave me time. I used it with the greedy efficiency of survival. I walked around the table, slow, as if gravity could be bullied into honesty by the right angle. The salt was not static. It thrummed, not sound. The same thrumming you feel when you stand with your palm flat to the chest of someone sound asleep. I put my hand on the wall and felt the faintest indentation give back to me like a bruise learn my name. You accept the chain, Silas said quietly, the words no longer a legal condition, but a question that had learned how to dress itself as a prayer. I accept, I said. He reached for me then, and this time he did touch. The back of my hand with the backs of his fingers. A brace, not a claim. We stepped closer until the space between us was the exact size of a decision. The air smelled of damp and dust and something sweet I could not name until I realized it was old beeswax from candles that had gone other places and left their scent as a trail. Say it, Mrs. Hart instructed with the mercy of a midwife. I accept the chain, I said, deliberate, each word seated on its chair. I accept the care of the apocrypha and the vaults and the registry. I accept that consent is not permission but a collaboration. I accept the late work. I accept the storm. And I, Silas said, his voice lower because he did not trust it with height, accept Elara Wren and the load of her consent and the consequences of the choices we will make. I accept the witnesses. I accept the storm. We pressed our hands into the salt. Flesh gave, salt remembered. When we lifted our palms, the imprint remained for a brief few seconds. 2 small hollows side by side then vanished. When it did, the faint outline above the slots that had refused to reveal itself darkened. Letters our names rose, not carved, but condensed, as if the salt had drawn moisture out of the air and built the words from our breath. Wren, Mercier. Between them, the faintest suggestion of a third line, unfinished. A space for the word I had seen in my dream, the one I had not recognized. It floated there now, not complete, not legible, waiting for a thing whose shape I could feel with the hunger behind my ribs, a name for what would be made between the two and not reducible to either. I did not say any of this aloud. I did not need to. The salt had decided to be patient. Equinox, then, Rosamond said, because every miracle requires a calendar entry. We will meet at dusk, the vow read aloud with witnesses, the ledger countersigned, the chain updated in the records. Records, Ivy said with a half-laugh that didn't escape the room. As if that wall isn't the only record that matters. We replaced the panel. The room exhaled without admitting it. Back in the main hall, the chandeliers trembled and then remembered themselves. The world resumed its previous level of self-importance. Outside, the rain had gentled into the kind of steady that keeps arguments from escalating. Ivy walked with me in silence to the car, and then did not get in. "Are you mad at me?" I asked. "Because I needed the people who loved me to be simple for a minute, and because they refused to be." "Never," she said. "I am mad at the sea, which refuses to adopt civility. I am mad at men for being both honest and necessary. I am mad at myself for being relieved that you will not leave me alone with this town. I am not mad at you." "Good," I said. And then, because we were who we were, I hugged her and it hurt in the correct way. "You'll be there?" "I will be wherever ugly truth gathers," she said. "Call me if you need bread." "I always need bread," I said, and she smiled in the precise way that told me she had already put butter on the list. Silas did not insist on the car returning me. He let me walk. It was an odd relief to be trusted with the town's distance. I went past the fishmongers. The school painted the wrong yellow. The shop window that had last month decided it was a gallery. Graymouth smelled like it had opened the back door to let the storm look in. At Perseverance Street, the rosemary stroked my coat with the intimacy of a cat. Inside the house, I stood in the small back room and looked at the desk like it was a person with whom I was about to confess something. I took out the ledger. I turned to a blank page and wrote in a new hand, "Acceptance of the chain." I dated it and left room for the signatures and the witnesses. Then I put my finger on the place where Aunt Corinne had written, "Remember," and finally said aloud what the word had been humming quietly since I came home. Not a vow to a person or a family or even a city, but to the practice of choosing and then bearing it. I made tea. Tea is a ritual that does not ask too much of you. The house seemed to relax its jaw. The clock in the hall shrugged into the rhythm the cathedral had taught it. Dusk cannot help itself in Graymouth. It performs. At the first sound of the tide turning hard in the throat of the harbor, there was a knock on the door that was not polite. I knew it was him by the way my body arranged itself toward the hinge before my mind could decide to be annoyed. "Walk," he said. "No hello, no coat. You should see what the chain has to do at sea level." We went to the quay. The sky wore its storm simply. The boats shifted like men turning over in bad dreams. He told me to stand with my feet apart and my hands in my pockets, and then not to move. "Watch," he said. The tide came for the town, with a speed tourists would have called rudely enthusiastic. The first lip of water slapped the lower rungs of the ladders, then climbed them with that obscene grace water has. Down the row, 2 boys shrieked in delight that felt like fear's younger cousin. A gull made the decision to go inland. The rain quit so it could watch. "Listen," he said, "it is easy to think of tides as volume. Enough water to fill enough space." But he was right. If you listened, you could hear the shape of the floor. You could hear where the water would throw itself tomorrow. Learn the way stone insists when it wants its due. I could feel the catacomb map in my palm. I could imagine the line, Aunt Corinne and Emile and all the others had learned like a prayer you recite to yourself while the water counts your ribs. I could feel the weight of authority on my tongue, that terrible sweetness that comes with choosing. Who do you tell? I asked after a long minute of not moving. On the night of count, he said. The harbor master, the hospital, Mrs. Hart, and the man with the keys to the school because he resents being useful and is therefore cautious. And after, I make donations that pretend to be accidents, he said, and I stand in rooms where men spit and do not defend myself, because sometimes someone needs to absorb the filth, and I bought the suit for it. You didn't answer the question, I said. He looked at me the way he had in the Apocrypha, without armor. I tell the person I trust to hate me for the right reasons, he said. And then I ask for dinner, because eating is the only way I remember the world does not only happen inside ugly rooms. You want dinner, I said, the word so ordinary it delighted me. With you, he said, as if he had owed someone that clarity for a while, and then added, before I could weaponize it, because you are going to do it with me, because you are going to be in those rooms, because we will need to eat between storms, because if we try to make a romance out of the chain will kill us, because if we refuse to let anything be tender, the chain will kill us anyway, because I don't know how to do this without you now that I've shown you the wall. There it was again, the thing I had been both dreading and requiring. Not a confession, not a seduction, an admission offered at ground level, in practical shoes, on a quay where the water was rehearsing taking the town back. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I could finally locate the breath I had mislaid. Dinner, I said, pretending I hadn't noticed when my voice went lower. But not at Mercier House, not under a chandelier. Bring me to a place that forgives elbows. He thought for 1 second and then, without smiling, said, Of course, there is only one place, and Mrs. Hart will put us to work if we try to leave without doing dishes. We ate stew that had the audacity to taste like warmth at a table with a nick that told the story of a night someone had refused to apologize. We washed bowls with the town. He dried. I stacked. He told me about Emile Mercier in the tone people reserve for relatives who would ruin a dinner party. I told him about my mother in the tone a person uses to let someone else know where all the knives are kept. We did not talk about Aunt Corinne, which was how I knew we would later. When he walked me back to Perseverance Street, the sky had decided to perform moonlight directly after storm, because even the night enjoys its own cliches. We stood at the gate under the rosemary that had outlived everyone with any right to judge. 2 days, he said. Equinox. 2 days, I said. And then we drown our first street together. He winced, not theatrically. He made a little sound like a man learning a new verb tense. We may not have to. The map is not a command. It is a compassion, I said, surprising both of us with the word. A net, he offered, and the two metaphors hung between us like clotheslines that both wanted the same wind. He looked at me then as if he were the one who had just consented to the chain and wanted to see what it would do to his face. The distance between us was again the exact size of an honest decision. The salt under our feet remembered every kiss anyone had ever had the audacity to attempt in a town like this. Desire is a kind of tide. It will take what it is owed. He did not reach for me. I reached. His mouth met mine like rain meets a roof that has done the work to hold it. no hunger beyond what the room could forgive, nothing we would have to apologize for later to the wall or to ourselves. It was not innocent. It was not unkind. It was the first greeting of what had already begun in rooms where salt holds secrets for centuries. When it ended, he did not rest his forehead on mine like men in movies do. He took one step back to make space for the fact we had not lied to the room nor to each other. "Good night, Elara," he said, and my name in his mouth was not a verdict now but a vow to be careful. "Good night, Silas," I said, because I had learned by now that if you do not call a person by their name after you kiss them, the town will pick one for you both, and it will be cruel. In the small back room, I took the ring box and put the empty cord back in it, then set it beside the ledger like a talisman we had used properly. I slept as if the map in salt had redrawn my veins and the blood had finally decided on which route it preferred. The equinox arrived the way deadlines do, both early and on time. Dusk brought the town in its good coat. The cathedral welcomed and did not forgive. On the way down the 17 steps, the 15th twice as tall as always, my hand brushed the healed seam in the wall where the flood had once taken more theory than water. The air cooled my lungs into precision. Ivy walked before me like a scout. Silas walked beside me like a decision made to look accidental. The chapel of names had prepared itself. Candles that did not drip stood at attention. The wall looked as if somebody had taught it restraint. The townspeople, those who knew, those who suspected, those who had come because they had heard this year's Wren, had come back with a mouth like a hinge gathered and kept their voices in their sleeves. Rosamond Keats read the vow as if it were any other vow, because that is her job. Mrs. Hart witnessed, with her hands flourless for once, having preferred that the bread be the only metaphor carrying weight in the room. The harbor master stood with the opinion of rope. "Read," Silas said, and his voice felt like what happens when a man takes his tie off and becomes more dangerous. I read the words Aunt Corinne had copied the way a person copies a prayer, without believing that the utterance changes the world, but knowing it changes the utterer. I said we would count not only money but damage. I said we would keep not only the book but the people. I said we would repair and apologize in equal measure. We would choose and sign and confess and refuse to let the sea take what it had not earned. I said my name at the end and felt it lengthen to reach my aunt's and my mother's and the first woman who had learned to brine fish so it would feed a winter. Silas said his own version. His included budgets and bolts and the instruction that men with keys to doors must be made to share them. He said his name at the end, the way a man names a tool he uses because he knows it can remove fingers as well as nails. People did not clap. The cathedral does not applaud. It stores sound for later. Someone, not me, not him, not Ivy, not Mrs. Hart, began a low hum that was not a tune and was not a tune. The wall received it and did not refuse. Afterward, when the candles had done their duty and been permitted to let their wax fall like shoulders relaxing, Silas led me to the Apocrypha. We opened the panel. The salt map waited, not bored. He touched a line. I watched it change. Not a movement one could prove. A shift, the way a person's certainty moves just out of the corner of their mouth when they learn they may be wrong. We could save both, he said, astonished. If we cut the grate under Blackwell's and use the side channel under the park, and if we ask the people on Sable Lane to open their cellars for us and promise them repairs the next day, we may not need to drown anyone. He laughed the kind of laugh that does not apologize for its joy because it knows it will have to soon enough. "Corinne," he said to the wall. And it was the first time I heard his voice break from my aunt and not from me. Genius. She knew this. She left it here for us to learn how to see. We planned. The harbor master sent a boy. Ivy took notes that would never be printed. Mrs. Hart left to call her sister who lived on Sable Lane and loved a project. The storm was scheduled for midnight. We had hours and a plan. Plans are simply current you choose, and hope does not look at you with its old eyes. At 10, the first wind came. The town adjusted its face. The men who had promised to open cellars opened them. The women who had promised to keep the hospital dry assembled their kettles and towels, and the kind of rage you use only against a weather system. The boats in the harbor settled into the posture of endurance. I stood with the key in my pocket, even though it had nowhere left to open, and thought of all the work that is simply waiting and not apologizing for how little it looks like action. At midnight, the first wave hit the quay with the insolence of a prodigal. The second wave argued eloquently. The third wave brought its friends. We went below. We watched the map. We listened to the floor. At 1, Silas gave the first order to open the underground grate. At 1:07, the harbor master made the kind of joke men make when they need others to see them as more useful than they feel. At 1:15, the hospital called to say their first floor was dry as a lecture. At 1:22, Mrs. Hart reported that Sable Lane was wet but laughing. At 1:30, the power went out, then returned embarrassed. At 1:40, Ivy cried exactly once and wiped her face with a sleeve, refusing to play a part. At 1:50, the water tried one last shape, then relented, the way oceans sometimes behave when they admit grudging respect for human choreography. At 2, we closed the grates. At 2:05, the map in salt sighed. It did not move. It permitted me to think we had not failed it. The room let us add our breath to its inventory. It was only then, when the city began to cough itself back into ordinary time, that Silas leaned against the wall and let whatever he had been holding slip off his shoulders. I stood in front of him and looked at his mouth without shame. We had not earned a second kiss. Those are not the economics of the chain. We had earned something more dangerous, the knowledge that we would want to kiss, and sometimes, not because the world required our mouths, elsewhere, on vows, on orders, on apologies, on prayers. "Come home," he said. And it was not an order, not a plea, an invitation people in this town have issued to tides, to wrong sons, to women with their hair down and their heels off. The phrase belongs to Graymouth. He put it in my hands. I did not yet know what it would cost. I did not yet know what it would buy. We walked out of the undercliff with our pockets full of different currencies. His had responsibility and the smell of wet rope. Mine had names and the feel of brass under a palm that had consented. Outside, the night was a coincidence of moon and blackout. The town held its breath and then let it go without drama. At Perseverance Street, the Rosemary blessed us without asking permission. At the door, we did not kiss. He put his fingers to the keyhole and then drew them back. Refusing to presume, "Good night," he said, and the chain between us was not a chain the mouth could break. "Good night," I said, and the chain between us was a ribbon with a wire in it. It held its shape. Inside, the desk waited, and I finally opened the file of letters addressed to my mother. The first was unsent, dated a year before I left, in a hand a little less neat than Aunt Corinne liked to approve of. "Sister," it began, "I have imagined 100 ways to write this. I have chosen the one that admits there is no correct way. The covenant is a sentence we choose to say, and it is also a chain that keeps the cathedral hung. We keep the town. We also hurt it. There is no version of this that does not ask us to draw water over someone. Once, women like us pretended to be asleep when the water asked. Now we have decided to be awake. I think that is what honor means. I will not forgive myself. And I will continue. If Elara comes to you one day and says the town is calling, do not pretend you do not hear it too. There were other letters. Some bitter as iodine, some sweet as a mistake you would make again. The last said only, the Apocrypha does not forgive, and that is how it teaches. I slept until noon, as if the town had decided not to need me, and the body had seized the reprieve, because it is not foolish. I woke to Ivy at the table with bread and bad coffee, and the face of someone who has chosen to love a place on purpose. You did it, she said around a mouthful. We did it. The hospital has dry floors. Mr. Law says he will go to church on Sunday and means it as a threat. Sable Lane has declared itself a club. Mrs. Hart is insufferable and therefore perfect. The Post says the ferry will pretend to run and then not. Graymouth exists. And death? I asked, because my aunt had left a particular kind of absence in the town's accounting. Dead is dead, Ivy said simply, but sometimes death allows a thing to behave like it should. Corinne would have enjoyed last night. She would have given you a cookie and an extra hour of sleep as a bribe to keep doing it. She would have scolded me for kissing him, I said, because I am not immune to pettiness. She would have scolded him for letting you, Ivy said, and then she would have set you both to making inventory, because the best way to punish desire in this town is with lists. We ate the bread. We made the lists. The ledger received our numbers the way floors receive the weight of furniture they were built to hold. The house learned our steps the way a cat learns which of your laps means business. The afternoon arrived without drama. The town rehearsed being ordinary. It did not forget. It simply stored last night in the part of itself that does not require daily maintenance. That is how places survive, by deciding which miracles to tie to the porch and which to let wander. In the evening, when sound turns elastic, the small back room filled with a light that did not have an origin, not lamp, not window, the sort of light you get when you stand inside a decision and your body runs a hand along the wall to admire the asset. I took the ring box and placed the empty cord on top of the ledger, and then, because I had finally earned the right, wrote one sentence on the inside cover under my aunt's name. We will choose and we will bear it, and we will love the people we drowned and the ones we save with the same ferocity, which is the only way to be honest in a town like this. After I finished writing, the room relaxed. Or I did. There would be storms. There would be streets whose names I would learn and then have to recite to the map, only to be told the ocean had decided they were necessary sacrifices. There would be new families who would ask, with the politeness of people who want to believe in the story they bought, why their basement smelled always faintly of sea. There would be an old woman who would place her hands on my cheeks after we flooded her shop because we had misread the map and say, without forgiveness, but with accuracy, now you know the taste of being wrong. There would be nights when I would not kiss him, and mornings when I would. There would be the chain which is not a chain, and the ribbon which is a chain. There would be the salt. There would be the choir of names. Come home, the town had said. I had. The sea, which is not romantic, agreed to carry the rumor. The cathedral, which is not sentimental, agreed to store it, and the ledger, which is not alive, began to breathe.